It's an honor and a privilege to be nominated to return to the Department of Justice and serve the American people at this critical moment in our democracy. I am humbled and exceedingly proud to join the remarkable team that you have put together to pursue the urgent, timeless cause of equal justice under law. We are at a crossroads. If I am fortunate enough to be confirmed, we will turn the page on hate and close the door on discrimination by enforcing our federal civil rights laws.
There is no doubt that for the past month, you've been hearing all the buzz about the looming threat of white supremacy. And of course, this was displayed no more explicitly than what took place at the start of the new year, when white men, cloaked with white bedsheets from head to toe, busted down the doors of the Capitol building, came riding in on horseback, and planted a burning cross at the center of the Senate chamber, all the while rubbing their hands together and salivating over the idea of lynching the first black congressman they can get the noose around. Or at least that's the image they want to brand deep into your memory. That thousands of white supremacists, also known as Trump supporters, or just simply white people, under the command of the president himself, launched a coup to overthrow the US government and establish white supremacy as the law of the land. But we know, in truth, that the event that played out on January 6th was not an insurrection. The unrest at the Capitol had nothing to do with race, and everything to do with the past election. What unfolded at the Capitol was the violent version of what is a broader concern about a now proven fraudulent election.
As long as people sincerely believe they can change things by voting, they stay calm. They don't storm the Bastille. They don't burst into the House chamber. They talk, and they organize, and they vote. But the opposite is also true. If people begin to believe that their democracy is fraudulent, if they conclude that voting is a charade, that the system is rigged, and it's run in secret by a small group of powerful, dishonest people who are acting in their own interests, then God knows what could happen. Actually, we do know what could happen. It's happening right now. Millions of Americans sincerely believe the last election was fake. You can dismiss them as crazy. You can call them conspiracy theorists. You can kick them off Twitter. But that won't change their minds. Rather than trying to change their minds, to convince them and reassure them that the system is real, that the democracy works, as you would do if you cared about the country or the people who live here, our new leaders will try to silence them.
Tens of millions of Americans, well over 70% of those that voted for Trump, are convinced that last November's election was stolen from them, which, in broader terms, means that they believe that something is severely wrong with the system that is governing over them, a system which they themselves put into power and maintain with their own tax dollars. But what directly led to the chaos was not last year's presidential election, for this took place 2 months after its conclusion. What set the turbulence into motion that day was rather the election that took place just 1 day prior. On January 5th, 2 Senate runoff elections took place in the state of Georgia, which would solely determine the balance of power in our government, which we ended up losing. And although the 2020 election was a major contributing factor to the mayhem that spilled over the following day, what really triggered the crowd at the Capitol was the fact that their side lost total control over all branches of their government, as a result of a corrupt and broken democratic and electoral system, coupled with the anxiety over the radicalism and terror that would be unleashed unto them by the Democrats, who now have complete control over every facet of power in this country.
Now we take Georgia, and then we change the world. Yeah! I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Mr. Schumer? Now we take Georgia, and then we change America.
Now, what I consider the actions carried out by our side, and I use the words our side with a grain of salt, because I can hardly call the people that took part in this event as those on our side, for they believe in almost nothing for which we stand for. But just for the sake of argument, would I consider the actions carried out by our side as a riot? Yes, I would. Would I consider it to be mob-like? Yes, I would. Would I consider it to be violent? Again, yes, I would. If we seek to be fair in criticism, then we should acknowledge that much. However, at the other end, I would also say this as well. They had it coming. And by they, I mean the establishment. Not just for the past 2 months, or even the past 4 or 5 years, but for generations, these people have been shoved aside, ignored, assaulted, and vilified by those who are meant to look out for their very interests. I can entirely sympathize with these folks and their decades-long frustrations, and the consequent actions that spurred up in them on the 6th of last month. I won't get into the topic of what sort of behavior is most appropriate for our movement in our current time. That I will save for a future video. But I will say this much about it. As I've already made it clear, our side did engage in violence, which is rather unfortunate. But while I denounce any act of senseless violence as wrong and unacceptable, I do, however, find it as understandable. While what they did was wrong, I can at least understand why they did it. What really drove them to wrestle with police, smash windows, and parade around the halls of the Capitol. I think it's worthy of noting that unlike the BLM riots of last year, which targeted homes, businesses, and civilians, the Capital Riot was at least directed at a political institution and was strictly political in its message. And by mentioning this, I'm merely pointing out the symbolism that presides over the Capital Riot, and the completely different story it tells as compared to the other. As a result of the violent episode at the Capitol, our anti-white establishment has and continues to react with such ferocity towards the fact that the very people which they so despise were able to prove an act of defiance against their authority and their legitimacy. All of Black Lives Matter and Antifa marched around our streets and unleashed their disorder and destruction for all to see, with total impunity from the law. And our side? The Capitol rioters were doxxed the very next day with their faces plastered on screens all across the country, and the FBI attempting to track down each and every one of them that could be identified. Our ruling class is now openly, without any regret or mercy, talking about launching a massive crackdown against the rioters, and everyone in this country that looks just like them.
Other members of Congress on the other side just tore off the mask completely and launched into open race hate on television. That's not an exaggeration. We wish it was. Here's Congressman Jamal Bowman explaining that the real problem with this country is white people. They're the threat to progress.
But this is a chance for all of us in Congress to sort of begin at a new baseline and stop spreading the myth of American exceptionalism and accept the fact that this is exactly who we are, and this is exactly who we've been throughout our country's history. Whenever there's social progress, there's white backlash.
There are millions of Americans, almost all white, almost all Republicans, who somehow need to be deprogrammed. It's as if they are members of a cult, the Trumpist cult, and who have to be deprogrammed. Do you have any idea how we start that process?
Did you hear that? They're almost all white. Do you have any idea how we start that process? Asked someone else on the set. Like, it's a perfectly reasonable suggestion and not at all dangerously insane. The story here is not that one member of Congress said this on television. The story is that many members of Congress and members of our media say this on television every single day, attack huge groups of Americans on the basis of their skin color, and nobody says anything. Nobody pushes back. as if there are no consequences to talking that way. But there are. How long can people keep talking like that and keep acting like this, irresponsibly, crazily, before something breaks? Before one of those 74 million hunted terrorist Trotskyite wreckers we keep hearing about becomes so overwrought and paranoid from watching demagogues like Jamal Bowman attack him on MSNBC that he does something truly awful that can't be taken back. And then the cycle accelerates radically, and an awful lot of people get hurt. That's where this is going. Everyone knows it. That's where this will go.
Just hours after the Capitol riot ensued, members of the media, heads of major corporations and social media platforms, and many top officials in the new president's administration, with a bullhorn to their mouth, publicly called for assembling a 9/11-style commission and passing surveillance and censorship-based legislation that is beyond insanity, that would go after white supremacists and members of other such perceived hate groups.
There is strong interest in the Congress in a 9/11 type commission.
Style commission will look at.
I think this is a big enough threat, an attack on the center of our democracy, that it's going to need a look that spans branches of government, something closer to a 9/11 commission.
What Jim Comey told you is that what happened in Washington on January 6th, the Chewbacca guy stumbling around the House floor and all of it, that was this generation's 9/11. And in fact, the magnitude of that atrocity begs for a better name. So from now on, we're going to call it 1/6. And that day will live in infamy for all time. Your grandchildren will get the day off from school every January 6th in remembrance of the horror that took place.
And isn't this just reminiscent of another certain calamity that has been ruthlessly exploited for over a year now by our globalist overlords, taking small or isolated events and using them as a pretext to completely revolutionize the system in order to advance their globalist revolution? Our ruling class seeks to create a total surveillance state, to hunt down and root out every last semblance of hate, which is to really say, anyone that opposes their vision. And while white people, more specifically, racially conscious white people, are the primary targets of this crackdown campaign, people of all colors along the conservative spectrum are also within their crosshairs. And this point is emphasized when conservative individuals have their social media accounts silenced.
Thanks to James O'Keefe at Project Veritas, we know that Jack Dorsey has plans for the rest of us that will extend far beyond the Trump era. Silencing Donald Trump was just the beginning. Guess who's next? You are! Watch.
We are focused on one account right now, but this is going to be much bigger than just one account, and it's going to go on for much longer than just this day, this week. I don't believe this is going away anytime soon, and the moves that we're making today around QAnon, for instance, is one such example of a much broader approach that we should be looking at and going deeper on.
He just admitted out loud what the rest of them are still denying. This isn't really about Donald Trump. It never was. It's definitely not about what happened last week at the Capitol. It is about controlling you and the country you thought was yours forever. Protect you by protecting themselves from criticism from you. See how that works? Right. You're protected when you can't speak.
When the tech giants coordinate with one another to simultaneously remove conservative-leaning social media platforms from existence.
Instead, they started a purge. Within hours, Democrats began crushing even the mildest dissent. They shut down an entire social media company called Parler, not because Parler had done anything wrong, but simply because they couldn't control it. They couldn't take the chance that somebody on Parler might criticize them, so they eliminated it. Yesterday, an op-ed in the New York Times asked this question. Are private messaging apps the next misinformation hotspot? Private messaging apps, Signal, a bunch of others. They're encrypted. No one can read it. The New York Times doesn't like this. Why? Because if they can't see what you're saying, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to say it. As the newspaper put it, quote, the shift to private messaging has renewed a debate over whether encryption is a double-edged sword. While the technology prevents people from being spied upon, it might also make it easier for criminals and misinformation spreaders to do harm without getting caught. Notice criminals and misinformation spreaders are in the same sentence. According to the Democratic Party, we need to start screening the social media accounts of people who work for the government just to make sure.
So it's time for us to open our eyes and recognize what's going on. The fact that we do not look at social media of potential recruits into the military flabbergasts me.
You, the social media companies, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, on, have a responsibility to do more right now, Melinda, in terms of getting this misinformation, this disinformation off their platforms.
They absolutely have a responsibility. The internet and the rise of social media has happened so quickly that really the regulations and the good policy making hasn't stayed out in front of it. And quite frankly, it needs to catch up.
It's really hard because what's happening is people are able to seek out the information that makes them feel good. That is what's happening, is that people have so much choice now. They can choose what their news sources are. They can choose what influencers they want to follow. We have to turn down the capability of these conservative influencers to reach these huge audiences. There are people on YouTube, for example, that have a larger audience than daytime CNN, and they are extremely radical and pushing extremely radical views.
When the media is deeply questioning whether white National Guardsmen and white military service members in general might be closeted white supremacists and a threat to the nation.
Democrats in Congress demanded that the troops sent to Washington this week submit to a political purity test, ideological vetting, as they put it, to make certain that every soldier professed loyalty to the new regime. Not loyalty to our country, not loyalty to our Constitution, but loyalty to the aims of a specific political party. Nothing like that has ever happened in America, and just a few months ago it would have been unimaginable. Suddenly it's compulsory. Here's Congressman Steve Cohen of Memphis explaining why it is.
The Guard is 90-some-odd%, I believe, male. Only about 20% of white males voted for Biden. You got to figure that in the Guard, which is predominantly more conservative, and I see that on my social media, and we know it, they're probably not more than 25% of the people that are there protecting us who voted for Biden. The other 75% are in the class that would be the large class of folks who might want to do something.
He said that every white man in this country is a potential murderer. Every white man in America should be under suspicion, purely on the basis of being white and male, of planning a presidential assassination. He told us the National Guard is overwhelmingly white and male. Therefore, Congressman Cohen says, white male National Guardsmen must undergo government background checks to prove they're not planning murder. Collective punishment is now the official policy of the federal government, and it's enforced by the Pentagon. You'd love at some point to ask Congressman Cohen about the implications of this. Since we've established this new standard, this new requirement of collective punishment, what other groups of Americans, Congressman Cohen, should be denounced and hurt simply because of the way they look, simply because of the DNA they were born with? Or does this new standard apply only to white men? And if it does apply exclusively to white men, which is definitely the impression we're getting from you, how does targeting white men contribute to your stated goal of reducing white male extremism? Because doesn't attacking people on the basis of qualities they can't control make them more extreme, not less extreme? Aren't you persecuting them into behaving in precisely the ways you claim you don't want them to behave? Now, suddenly, on top of all of that, they've been told that if they were born a certain way, if they're white and male and therefore evil and dangerous, they themselves are under suspicion of being the enemy. They're potential killers, assassins, betrayers of a nation. We're not overstating this for effect. Here's a National Guard commander in Puerto Rico describing to his troops the enemy they will face in Washington. They are white nationalists, he tells them. They are Proud Boys.
Nacionalista y un grupo cuyos colores típicamente se visten en amarillo y negro. Ese grupo se conoce como los Proud Boys.
If you wanted to stoke an irreparable civil conflict, you would talk this way, and you would keep talking that way. You'd tell armed men under your command that they might have to shoot people who voted for the wrong candidate in the last election. You can see where this could all go. It's really scary.
When a bank, which holds a customer's wealth and personal information without prior knowledge or consent, turns that customer over to federal officials because they might have engaged in controversial political acts of which there is no definite proof of.
This show has obtained exclusively evidence that Bank of America, the second largest bank in the country with more than 60 million customers, is actively but secretly engaged in the hunt for extremists in cooperation with the government. Bank of America is, without the knowledge or the consent of its customers, sharing private information with federal law enforcement agencies. Bank of America effectively is acting as an intelligence agency, but they're not telling you about it. In the days after the January 6th riot at the Capitol, Bank of America went through its own customers' financial and transaction records, a lot of them. Now, these were the private records of Americans who had committed no crime. People who, as far as we know, had absolutely nothing to do with what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. But at the request of federal investigators, Bank of America searched its databases looking for people who fit a specific profile. Imagine if you were that person. The FBI hauls you in for questioning in a terror investigation, not because you've done anything suspicious. You haven't. You bought plane tickets and visited your country's capital. You thought you could do that. You thought it was your country. Now they're sweating you because your bank, which you trust with your most private information of everything you buy, has ratted you out to the feds without telling you, without your knowledge.
When independent journalists can literally be arrested for posting memes online that are branded as misinformation or that mock those in power.
Doug Mackey learned that the hard way this morning. Mackey is a 31-year-old conservative journalist from Florida. At 7 a.m., FBI agents showed up at Mackey's house. They threw him in handcuffs and they dragged him to a cell. He now faces 10 years in prison. His crime? He made fun of powerful Democrats on social media. As the federal criminal complaint puts it, quote, Mackey made coordinated use of social media to spread disinformation relevant to the impending 2016 presidential election. This disinformation, the Biden administration solemnly explained, quote, often took the form of memes. Yes, memes. Online mockery. Mockery online is now illegal when it's aimed at the wrong people. Doug Mackey hurt their feelings, so they put him in jail. According to Joe Biden's Justice Department, Doug Mackey violated 18 U.S. Code Section 241. Have you ever read 18 U.S. Code Section 241? Probably not, but you should. Look it up. When you read it, you will learn that Joe Biden's Justice Department is lying in a very obvious way, and that should make you very nervous. It turns out that federal law does not ban memes, or for that matter, misinformation, whatever that is. The law that Biden's prosecutors are citing instead prohibits, quote, conspiring to injure, oppress, threaten, or intimidate anyone from exercising the right to vote. According to the law, that would include kidnapping voters, invading their homes, sexually abusing them. Doug Mackey didn't do any of that, not even close to any of that. Doug Mackey made memes. Therefore, he's a domestic terrorist. Speech is violence, dissent is a felony. What, you may be wondering, does a case like this mean for the First Amendment? Well, it means that it's effectively suspended. You can now be arrested for saying the wrong things. And at 7 a.m. this morning, one journalist actually was arrested for that. A literary agent in New York, works for a literary agency in the city, recently fired, not because of what she said online, but because she maintained accounts on Parler and Gab. Those are free speech alternatives to corporate social media. The employee's name is Colleen Offline, and she joins us tonight. Colleen, I appreciate your coming on. So I really wanted to talk to you just to make sure I got this right. You were fired not because you said something outrageous or immoral online, but because you used specific social media platforms?
Yes, you are correct. That's what I got fired for. I created a profile on Parler and I created a profile on Gab. I posted the same exact content on Twitter as I posted on those social media platforms, and that's what I got fired for.
And when prominent Democratic members of Congress accuse their Republican counterparts as being white supremacist sympathizers.
Democrats then declared war on their rival political party. Not, by the way, a metaphorical war, but an actual one with soldiers and paramilitary law enforcement and the world's most powerful intelligence agencies. They denounced Republicans, even fairly moderate establishment figures who pose really no conceivable threat to anyone. They denounced them as dangerous terrorists. They likened them to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And anyone who complained about this or fought back in any way was threatened with expulsion from Congress. In other words, it doesn't matter what voters decided in November. In the name of democracy, you can no longer serve in the Congress. That's what they said. Nor are dissidents permitted in the federal bureaucracy. No one who disagrees with our beliefs, Democrats have announced, can work in the U.S. government.
There are legitimate white supremacist sympathizers that sit at the heart and at the core of the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives. There's no consequences for racism, no consequences for misogyny, no consequences for insurrection, and no consequences means that they condone it. We are now away from acting out of fealty to their president that they had in the Oval Office. And now we are talking about fealty to white supremacist organizations as a political tool.
But hairy stoners in Viking hats are not the only threat that Sandy Cortez faces tonight. No, far from it. There are the other members of Congress to worry about. Some of them are Republicans, and you know what that means. At any moment, these people are likely to open fire indiscriminately on the House floor purely out of racism. And of course, she's worried about that. Listen.
We still don't yet feel safe around other members of Congress.
How many are we?
I think a very considerable amount.
But they label their efforts as, quote, a domestic war on white supremacy, to make it appear as though their war is a good and much needed one, only to be waged against white supremacists that don't even exist. But of course, they already know this. They know this enemy doesn't exist, and so, like in a novel, they have to invent a fictional antagonist just to keep their story going. And since this menace to society, this white supremacist, will never be found, this will grant our leaders the permission to perpetuate this war against us without end. Our own government plans to initiate an all-out domestic war on tens of millions of ordinary Americans, as though they are hunting down Islamic terrorists with bombs strapped to their chest, ready to detonate.
Wait. American National Security official Andy McCabe is telling us they're like ISIS, Islamic State in Syria? Aren't those the wild-eyed lunatics who beheaded journalists and set all those people on fire and then videotaped themselves doing it? Wow, that's terrifying. That's right, Mr. and Mrs. America. What we didn't tell you before was that ISIS was for Donald Trump. That's why they were murdering so many people. They were the Syrian branch of MAGA. You may have heard it was some kind of Islamic thing. Come on. That's racist. It was Donald Trump all along. Now, those people are in this country, in Dallas and Sarasota and Newport Beach, everywhere. They're hiding in plain sight. God knows what they will do next. Actually, we do know. Another 9/11. That's what they're planning. And the point was that this was an attempted coup d'etat, and the U.S. government needs to act accordingly. Again, we are quoting here. Quote, we defeated al-Qaeda and can do the same thing to the fascist thugs who attacked our democracy last month, but only if we take similar hard measures against the enemy within. Bombing American citizens with military drone strikes in this country just because you don't like their politics, a little over the top, maybe a little too far, maybe not the unity we were looking for, but things have changed. Supporters of Donald Trump, it turns out, were so dangerous that maybe they do deserve Hellfire missiles raining down on their homes. Watch.
We had a policy, and it was very controversial, of attacking terrorism at its root, of going after and killing, and in the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, an American, a Yemeni American, with a drone strike for the crime of inciting violence, inciting terrorism.
They're literally declaring war on their own population. How's that going to end? And if you think we're overstating it, we're not. Here's the former CIA director describing what the enemy looks like.
And this threat from domestic violence extremists is much more challenging, I believe, than it was in terms of going after foreign terrorists. The domestic violence extremists are much more pervasive. Their numbers are much larger. When we were going after al-Qaeda or other types of terrorist groups, cells here in the United States, their numbers were in the single digits of dozens, and was finding needles in a haystack. Here, there are a lot of haystacks with a lot of needles in them. They have the wherewithal. They already have the weapons that, if they so choose to use them, they can, in fact, carry out these deadly attacks.
These people, meaning you, quote, have the weapons, these terrorists. By terrorists, Brennan, means tens of millions of American citizens who might have a firearm at home and didn't vote for Joe Biden. They're the threat, and we need to hunt them as we hunted al-Qaeda.
Now that they are in control of the system, they plan to use the full capacity and force of every institution in this country to eliminate this threat. They want to bring the entire legal and intelligence systems down upon our heads, to strip us of our protections, rights, and privacies, to make us vulnerable and exposed, breaking our ability to actively fight back against the subsequent political, social, psychological, economic, and physical oppression that are all bound to follow. They've been plotting to launch such a terror campaign against the native people of this country for decades, but they were, for the most part, unofficial about it. But now it is official, and they are holding nothing back. While this is not the first time we have heard our elites preach about the non-existent scourge of white supremacy, it has certainly ascended onto a whole other level of hysteria.
The leaders of the Democratic Party have now decided that 74 million Trump voters weren't just wrong or misguided. They didn't simply back the wrong guy or have incorrect opinions or fail to see the obvious truths. No, the threat they pose is graver and more serious than that, more dangerous. These 74 million Trump voters are in fact terrorists. They're a looming physical threat to the rest of us, and we must deal with them in the way that you deal with threats like that, existential threats to the nation. Saddam Hussein, al-Baghdadi, Kim Jong-un, Donald Trump's voters. 74 million deviationists lurk in our midst. They look like normal people, but ladies and gentlemen, do not be deceived. They are Trotskyites. They're wreckers, kulaks. We must root them out. It'll take a war to do that, an actual war, a war on our own people. You need to re-educate people like that, possibly in camps, re-education camps, if you will. You must deprogram them.
We had programs, federal programs, that went towards funding organizations like these that de-radicalized people. And President Trump pulled the plug on federal funding for some of these programs. And so one thing that we know is that we have to get that funding right back up, and we probably need to double, triple, quadruple, or increase funding for these de-radicalization programs.
They're trying to use this moment to increase their own power. So they're lying about what you saw. They're calling it a precisely orchestrated coup attempt. They're using what happened last week to justify the most sweeping crackdown on civil liberties and free speech in the history of this country. Just in the last several hours, we have heard people in positions of power and authority demand that those who support Donald Trump should no longer be allowed to publish books or use the internet or fly on airplanes. Driving cars, holding jobs, staying in hotels, those will certainly be next, and we're barely exaggerating. In fact, we're predicting it.
Our elites are aware that although white people, still in the masses, don't think in terms of their own racial interests, they know something is wrong with the system and, in a sense, voted collectively in 2016 and again in 2020. And they only needed the slightest reason, such as a riot, to enact their harsh punishments against us, not only for what happened on January 6th, but for the American white man and woman daring to voice their concerns and electing a man that completely disrupted their malevolent agenda. We think differently, and thus we vote differently, and they know that the way we think and the way we vote will severely falter their plans. They could care less about some lone white male grabbing a gun and going out on a shooting spree. The collective awakening of whites is the real threat of white supremacy for them. This domestic war on white supremacy is just a cover to silence white advocates and their broader nationalist movement, and to subdue their efforts to resist what the anti-white Democrats have in store for them. For now, mainly being the attempt to deprive white Americans of their rights, their wealth, their power, their resources, and their land, among others, and redistributing it to non-whites. We won't be too far behind South Africa at this pace. And what a timing it was for this incident to occur last month, just as Democrats were set to be sworn into power. That once cherished, united, and free America is gone, and it kills me to admit this. Hold on to your memories of living a happier and freer life, but don't be prisoners to the past. Preserve them to build a better future for yourself and your kind. Once we acknowledge this, that the America that was once worth dying for is gone, and that the new America is not worth even an ounce of blood, we can allow this new reality to settle in and begin the work to save ourselves and our people from sinking further into the abyss. And everyone can do something. We must first and foremost take measures to protect and secure ourselves as best we can. This includes getting our bodies into shape and keeping ourselves healthy, looking into investing in alternative but secure forms of currency, protecting ourselves online from the prying eyes of our government and corporations by using encrypted virtual private networks, or VPNs, and quietly buying a gun while we still have the right to do so, and doing anything to keep it. I would also strongly urge everyone to support those who are willing to take the risk in spreading the word about this unfolding catastrophe, whether they are independent, nationalist content creators on video sharing platforms, especially ones outside of YouTube, through donating or getting into contact with them, or simply just by sharing their videos with anyone that is willing to give them a listen. To our one and only mainstream public figure, Tucker Carlson, this man is as close as we will ever get to a national spokesman for our concerns and our interests. He is the only one with a national platform who has the courage to publicly and explicitly push back against toxic and anti-white ideas, such as critical race theory, the fictional epidemic of white supremacy, and the general injustices and mistreatment perpetrated against white Americans. And it truly baffles me that his voice has survived the ongoing effort to silence it. And there is no doubt that in the next 4 years, they will surely pick up steam on that effort. And although he does not cover everything we wish he would cover, or we may disagree with some things he puts out there, and I certainly do, we should do anything and everything to keep him going, because, just like Trump, when he's gone, we will miss him dearly. Above all, build connections and keep connections. This would be the most crucial and impactful advice I could give to anyone in our movement. One of the fastest and most effective ways to cripple our movement is to cut off connections from each other, which is exactly what their crackdown is all about. Without the ability to connect and communicate with one another, we are effectively alone in the dark. One such service that can be used in this endeavor is natconnect@protonmail.com, introduced and run by Way of the World, whom I also encourage you to get in touch with, that has already helped thousands of nationalists build promising bonds. If circumstances permit, I would highly recommend everyone to consider using this service while it's still up and running. Assuming you take the necessary precautions, take safe and steady steps to create solid connections with other fellow nationalists around the country, and maybe even around the world. It's an invaluable tool in our unprecedented times, so take advantage of this opportunity while it still stands. And if you plan to do so, do it soon. They said it could never happen here. How wrong they were. how detached from reality they were. This country died a long time ago, partly as a direct consequence of those kinds of people with those kinds of beliefs. And now, we are beginning to understand what those most un-American of feelings really feel like, as she continues to rot away. The only question that remains: will we survive the monsters that parade among her ruins?